Major victory for House Republicans probing the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has agreed to allow all members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to view the Dissent cable that came from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul in July of 2021, just before the disastrous withdrawal began. The document reportedly warned Kabul would collapse soon after U.S. troops pulled out. Joining us now is the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, Michael McCaul, who threatened to hold Blinken in contempt of Congress if all the lawmakers on his panel didn't get to see that cable. We're seeing this movie an awful lot. It's like you subpoena a document, they don't produce it, you threaten to hold them in contempt of Congress, and suddenly the document shows up.
It's amazing when you apply pressure and the threat of contempt how secretaries will decide to comply. Yep. They won't respond to our letter requests, but when they hear contempt, they do respond. I don't think Blinken wanted to be the first Secretary of State ever to be held in contempt as well. But what I found extraordinary when I read this Dissent cable, and it is classified, was the 23 employees at the embassy are heroes. They called it exactly as it was. State of mind at the time before the collapse, exactly what happened. Massive deterioration, the fall of the Afghan army, and the need to get people out of there in advance. The problem, John, there wasn't a plan. If you don't have a plan, you plan to fail. And that's exactly what happened when they put the Taliban in charge of our evacuation.
I don't pretend to know a whole lot about anything, but I knew it was going to happen. and that was completely unclassified.
And one thing they talk about is, the narrative, this rosy narrative that we're doing so well. Even the embassy was saying this is going to hurt us, and it's going to cost American lives and Afghanistan lives, and that's exactly what happened.
Well, that is exactly what happened. So you're saying this is classified, so the American people will never get to see this document. But what about the families of our troops that died over there? They were heroes trying to help these folks, these babies, and we see all the pictures. What about these families? Do we ever see accountability?
They deserve accountability. I'm doing this for them. I'm doing it for the veterans and the Gold Star families. The mothers have come to me, particularly those whose sons and daughters were killed at Abbey Gate in the suicide bomber, where, by the way, our sniper had the suicide bomber in his sights, was not given permission to engage. This investigation is far from over. I would hope state could declassify this document because the American people need to see what has happened and what were they thinking at the time that the bombing occurred and the warnings that were in place. Transparency is important here, and I want to hold them accountable.
The father of Staff Sergeant Darren Hoover, who was one of the 13 who was killed outside the Abbey Gate, says it was bullcrap, his words, that only you and Greg Meeks got to see this memo in the first place. You said that you think the American people should see this. This is going to be, foreign policy at least, is going to be a big issue in the 2024 campaign. And if there's a document out there that suggests that this disastrous withdrawal should never have happened and warned the president, who's running again for re-election, that it shouldn't happen, and then we saw the whole thing fall apart. Should the public, should the electorate out there get a chance to see this so that they can make up their minds about who to vote for?
I believe they should. And the level of classification is confidential. It's very, very low. And the fact
you could redact.
There was a cry for help. They were asking for help. They didn't get the help. And that's why Americans were left behind. That's why 100,000 Afghan partners and interpreters were left behind. And my God, the women left behind is the saddest story about the whole. And most importantly, to your point in the presidential race, this was a turning point because right after this happened, guess what the Russian Federation's doing? They're moving towards Ukraine. Guess what Chairman Xi's doing? He's meeting with Putin in Beijing, and he's got his sights on Taiwan.
I want to get to Iran and Ukraine as well, especially with this big bilateral meeting happening between the UK PM and the president. But first to Iran, officials now saying that they've got these hypersonic ballistic missiles. Your reaction to that?
It's frightening because they have 85% weapons grade uranium. 90% is full weapons grade. They're so close. Hypersonic, we cannot stop it. We don't have a hypersonic in the United States, yet China had one that circled the globe with precision that can carry a nuclear payload. If Iran gets to 90% enrichment, and they have a hypersonic that 15 times the speed of sound, we can't stop that.
Wow. Scary.
And the worst thing about it, John and Aisha, is that it's built on the backbone of American technology. They have stolen this stuff, and then we export and sell it to them. And that's one thing on my committee. We have to stop selling them the technology that they'll put in their military apparatus that then can be turned against us.
You know, we talked at the beginning about this movie that seems to be recurrent in Washington about the subpoena, then the threat for contempt of Congress. There's another movie that appears to be in the midst of a sequel. And this is a potential deal that the Biden administration is working on with Iran to trade restrictions on its nuclear program and hostages for another $17 billion in payments to Iran. We saw this movie once. Do we need to see it again?
Airplanes of cash. You don't reward bad behavior. You know, I love history.
Unless you're Barack Obama and apparently Joe Biden.
And give them cash. When you project power and strength, you get peace. When you project weakness, as we did in Afghanistan, as we're doing with Iran, guess what you get? You get conflict and you get war. And that's why we're seeing all these hot spots, whether it's Ukraine and in Europe to the Pacific and Taiwan, to Iran and the Middle East.
Can I ask you on Ukraine, because this is going to probably come up between these two leaders who are meeting right now and where they go on Ukraine. Speaker McCarthy has come out repeatedly now and said that he does not support a supplemental for Ukraine. Ukraine's about to run out of our aid as early as September, even sooner. Are these the right comments to be making right now?
Well, I think he's saying let's follow regular order. I know the speaker supports our efforts in Ukraine. We still have a lot of unspent money on the table. I would argue that why aren't we giving them everything they need for this counteroffensive? We've held back consistently from giving them what they need. I talked to the UK Prime Minister yesterday and their Secretary of Defense, and they said if you're not going to give the long-range artillery to hit the Iranian drones in Crimea, then we are. So the Brits are putting in the long-range artillery to hit Crimea. And we're not doing that. The F-16s was G7, not Biden, and we could have trained the pilots a year ago.
Do you think Ukraine attacked that dam? Nord Stream? Don't you think the American people ought to know?
The intelligence is not confirmed on that. That's all I can really say at that point. But you know what? The Russians hit the dam around the nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The counteroffensive is getting ready to begin. And they need to be successful. If they are not, then I think the will of the American people will evaporate. If they are successful, everybody likes to bet on a winning horse.
Yeah. To Josh's point, though, if we're going to fund this thing, we should know what's going on.
We should. It's all about transparency, right?
Yeah. One would like to think. Congressman, great to see you. Thank you for coming in. Appreciate it.
You too, John.
Chairman, thank you, as
Thanks
always.
so much.
Well, tens of millions of Americans are